All right, welcome everybody to the Friends of Cabildo lecture series. And if you're here live or you're watching this later on at home, I want to thank you here. This is always a free membership program, a lecture program for our members, and then it's a very small fee if you're not a member, but you can very quickly pay for it just by becoming a member of the Friends of the Cabildo. This is our last one for the month of March, and then we're going to return back in April with three lectures. Um, uh, uh, Peter Dedick is going to be talking about the cemeteries of New Orleans, a cultural history. Dr. Eric Chris is going to do the boss of New Orleans, Martin Berman, and machine politics in the Crescent City. And then Mickey Pfeffer is going to be doing the golden age of New Orleans department store advertising. And you can find all that information at friendsofthecabildo.org. But tonight we're going to be talking about some cocktails, and I'm excited to hear how this book came about and how much fun it obviously was to write the book. But our speaker tonight is a former journalist and a government official and a professor at the Manship School of Mass Communications at LSU, who's written multiple books specifically on Woodrow Wilson, among others. I want to welcome John Hamilton.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'll start where Jason said I should start. That is with the question, why did I write this book? But I also, however, want to just thank everybody for showing up for this. I appreciate that. I hope I don't disappoint you. And I very much appreciate the Cabildo and all the good work that these public museums do to preserve knowledge. Makes our lives much richer. The question's often asked why I wrote the book, which is officially coming out in a couple of weeks. And the answer is probably one of just serendipity. Usually the books I write are longer and they're more edgy, if you will. That is, they're about important political topics. My last book was on the origins of government propaganda in World War I. This one sort of fell in my lap. LSU Press said they were doing cocktail books, and it sounded like fun. They also said the book they wanted was short, which sounded like a lot of fun, since my last book was 250,000 words, and this one is only 18,000. And it seemed like a good little reprise from what I usually write. And so I agreed to do it. The book had another serendipitous part to it, which is that, as I said, my last book was on propaganda. And it turns out the French 75 is all about propaganda, and all about propaganda in World War I. Also should say that there was also kind of a pattern that repeats itself. I like to do books that require a lot of sniffing around, interviewing people, going through old archives, things like that. I like to turn over every rock I can find and see what might be under it. I've always said, as a journalist, the best stories you find, I always say the stories you find are always so good, if you do a real job of reporting, that they're better than anything you can make up. And that certainly is the case with this drink. So let me just say, to start out, what the bottom line is, and then I'll build on that by giving you the story, the search for the real French 75. It was born as a propaganda exercise in World War I to honor the French 75 millimeter artillery piece. And it's carried on because even though the gun has become less well remembered, the name of the drink, the 75, is very sexy and has a certain mystique about it. And second of all, the drink has managed to change with the times. I would argue it's the most elastic drink that you could possibly have in the world of cocktails. Now, having given you that preamble, let's start where the drink, or where we can begin to think the drink, took shape. And that would be February 7th, 1915, on a rainy Sunday morning in France, when hundreds of women went out into the streets to sell little medals. These medals had the French colors on it, red, white, and blue, and hanging on the end of it was a small medal that had embossed on it the gun. This was considered the day of the 75. The Touring Club of France had organized this because they hoped to raise money to send care packages, or what today we would call care packages, to French troops in the front. You may remember the war started in August, September of the year before, so the war had been going on about 5 or 6 months. The turnout for this, or the response to this effort to sell these medals, was overwhelming. 22 million of them were sold. They ended up in buttonholes that day, and they raised 5.5 million francs, which of course is an enormous sum of money. And our French artilleryman wrote that no one would have dared to continue walking with an undecorated buttonhole. Such was the patriotic spirit that reigned at the time. But what's important about this artilleryman is, if indeed it was an artilleryman who wrote those lines, is that it appeared in a book called R75, which is an exquisite book that was produced to commemorate the day. And it has even pop-up replicas of the gun. In other words, the kind of pop-up book you have for your children when you open it up and something appears. Well, in this case, the gun appears with all kinds of complexity because the gun was a very complex gun. The gun is considered the first modern artillery piece, and it had a number of advantages that other artillery pieces didn't have. For one thing, it was a gun that could be fired from behind a barricade, so it didn't have to see its target, and it didn't have to be resighted after it's shot. In other words, usually the recoil of the gun in those days meant that you had to move the gun back in place, resight it, and then fire again. And it could fire very rapidly, so they could fire as many as 30 rounds a minute. So this gun was so powerful that it changed the equation for the French. Some people believe that Paris managed to save itself from the German invaders at the very beginning of the war because of the French 75. And the French 75 appeared on battlefields all over France and was used also by American and British troops. The number in France alone, owned by the French alone, grew from 4,000 to 12,000 by the end of the war. Harry Truman actually commanded, the future president commanded a battery of French 75s. And one of his soldiers wrote, this is a quote, "The destruction that had been wrought by our guns looked like humans, dirt, rocks, trees, and steel had been turned up by one plow." And the accounts of the gun by American foreign correspondents and by the French and by British correspondents are much the same, celebrating how this gun worked. Here is a line from the British War Illustrated, which was created during the war by a proper commercial publisher of newspapers, but meant to be a patriotic propaganda publication. The first issue of the British War Illustrated reported, "The French 75s have so scared German gunners that their officers chained themselves to their guns in order to hold them. The officers chained them to their guns in order to hold them in the line of fire." And we have another one from the New Orleans Herald. "American gunners are teaching those French 75s to talk United States to the Germans." So the gun was celebrated everywhere. In France, after this particular event that I described, the day of the French 75 in February of 1915, led to an outburst of propaganda related to the 75 millimeter gun. There were songs, there were poems. One poem was called "Our French 75," just like the book, and the poem began, "It imposes itself on our thoughts, the name of the glorious cannon." But it wasn't just songs and poems. The images of the guns appeared in romantic postcards, posters, clocks, and watches, board games. I'm going to read all of these because it's so extraordinary, and I don't even have a complete list here. Pens and sculpted inkwells. These are inkwells that had the gun as part of the stand for the light. Cigarette papers, cigarette cases, cigarette lighters, plates, spoons, coffee mugs, ersatz coffee, wines and chocolates, spools of cotton, plaques, handkerchiefs, decorative boxes, padlocks, believe it or not, and rings. I'm going to stop there. the list, as I say, goes on, but it tells you how the French 75 captured the imagination of the French. And out of this, at the same time, appeared the French 75 cocktail. The first recipe we have from this time in 1915, early 1915, is in an article in the New York World. It was brought over by a French correspondent named E. Alexander Powell, who was covering the war for the World. And the recipe was gin, applejack, lemon juice, and grenadine. So I should point out that when we say applejack, the idea is that it would be jacked apples, which of course makes it more as the freezing goes on and the alcohol is the non-frozen part. That's one way to make applejack. But as Dan Davis at Commander's Palace helped me understand, the applejack that they used was almost certainly distilled apples, which is what Calvados, the brandy Calvados, is really about. And I might say, since this is a New Orleanian audience, that Dan Davis did me a huge favor. We made all the French 75s we could find recipes for one day downstairs at Commander's to figure out which ones were the best and which ones were not so good. This one, by the way, is not so good. It's very powerful, but it's much too sweet. Those were drinks that people liked in those days, but still much too sweet. Excuse me for coughing. I'm cured, but I'm at the tail end of COVID, so I'm afraid I'm a little stuffy. There are, of course, other kinds of versions, and the champagne version is one that most people know today, and we're going to come back to that. So how was the drink actually created? Well, we don't know for sure, but we know that there is a prehistory to the French 75. In other words, it wasn't the first time that Calvados was used, or even gin. There was actually gin used in France as early as 1775. It was called Geneviève, which is a predecessor of gin. So you can imagine somewhere in France, many places, that people were making combinations of drinks with lemon juice and sugar and Calvados and sometimes even champagne. And so it wasn't as though the ingredients and the idea hadn't existed, but we can imagine how it materialized. Bartenders like to make up their own drinks, and people who are just in a small community can decide to make up their own drink, and they give it a name. And so somebody decided to put together this combination I mentioned to you, probably that combination. We don't know if there was a version earlier. And they used those French ingredients, and then all of a sudden they came up with a French 75, and it would have been served in it was served in bars in Paris. The first time we know it was served in a bar called Henry Tepe's, Tepe, which is the first watering hole that has a recipe that's mentioned in recipe books. It's in the Opera District. It doesn't exist anymore. Tepe was a beloved bartender and bar owner. He was German born, and the war was so difficult for him. At the end of the war, he actually committed suicide. So at this point, the trail becomes somewhat muddy. All kinds of things are said about the French 75 that are unsupported by any credible fact. One of them, for example, is the troops drank French 75s before going over the trenches and facing withering fire over no man's land. There's no evidence for that. It's true that some soldiers were allowed to have toddies, but there's no evidence that they were downing French 75s. And by the way, the French 75s in those days were very, very strong, and it's unlikely it would have been a good idea for them to drink them before going into battle. We can come back to some of this, but I think we should pick up the trail now and look at where various people have said the French 75 first appeared or believe it appeared, and what I found when I went to these various places. And the first is Buck's Club. Buck's Club is a gentleman's club in London. It dates back to actually World War I, which is important in this story. It was founded by a British cavalry officer named Buckmaster, and wanted to have a place for his comrades from the war, officers, to congregate. There are many older clubs, of course, that go back hundreds of years, Brooks and Boodles and so forth. But Bucks Club managed to get quite a lot of history early on because because it appeared in many books by P.G. Wodehouse, the very funny British novelist. And in fact, he even uses the name of Pat McGarry, who was the head bartender in some of his books. And if you like Wodehouse, and I happen to like Wodehouse, his scenes from what is supposed to be Bucks Club, although he doesn't call it that, it's called the Drones Club, actually, in his books, are very funny. Drones are bees that don't do much of anything to work. And that is why he comically named the book, or named the club, Drones Club. So it's been said that the drink started there. This is not possible for several reasons. First of all, that the war, we have the first version of the drink we have is in 1915. That's good enough for a start. But Bucks Club itself today claims, contrary to what some people say, that they have never served the French 75. And in fact, I had trouble getting in to see the club when I asked to get in, because you have to get special permission, of course. And Major Lendrum, who is the director and a former equerry to Prince Charles, kept insisting to me there's no history of the French 75. The history that he cares about actually is P.G. Wodehouse. He's trying to collect all of P.G. Wodehouse books for their rather modest library. But finally, he let me in, and I interviewed bartenders, and all of them said they never served a French 75, could never remember there being a French 75. Well, Bucks is not the original French 75 locale, but it's clearly wrong that they never sold French 75s or served them. And there are several reasons for this. One is that people had been drinking French 75s during the war all the time. And so it's hard to imagine the British officers coming back are not wanting a French 75 at what becomes their club. Second of all, the head bartender, Pat McGarry, had been in the war himself, and so he must have known about the French 75. But most important of all, one of the first bartenders they hired to work with Pat McGarry was a friend of his, and his name was Harry McAlone. And Harry is considered one of the great promoters of the French 75. So it's unlikely that there was no French 75 served at Bucks Club. Here were Harry and Pat McGarry and Harry McAlone standing side by side, and certainly somebody came in and said, "Hey, I'd like a French 75." Anyway, the club has not changed its view on that, but it hasn't changed its view on a lot of things. In fact, Major Lendrum has been known to say that he doesn't think women should ever be admitted to Bucks Club because why would the members want to talk about purses? Some of you may find that a rather antediluvian point. Now, Harry McAlone. Harry worked at many famous bars, and in the early 1920s wrote a book called Harry's ABCs of Mixing Cocktails, which is a famous book. And around the time that book came out, he left Ciro's, which had a famous bar in London, and also a bar on the coast of Normandy. And he went to buy a bar very close to Henry Teppe's bar in the Opera District. It was called the New York Bar. And he renamed it Harry's New York Bar. Excuse me. Pardon me. He bought it in 1922. His book came out in 1921. And he had a recipe for that drink, which is extraordinarily good. To my mind, it's the best French 75 that is made. And I drink it all the time. It's Calvados, gin, and I actually make it with Navy strength gin, so it's really strong. Grenadine and absinthe. Tiny drop of absinthe, just enough to coat the bottom of the glass. That's the closest one we also know to what is the old French 75 that was served in the 1915 recipe. It's not served anymore at Harry's because I think it's too strong a drink and tastes have changed a bit. And lots of people don't like absinthe. Harry's, I should stop here and say, Harry's has about as much interest in history as the Bucks Club, although on the surface it seems to have a lot. Its it was a place where a lot of famous journalists, movie stars, boxers, expatriates came to drink and have a good time with each other. And so it's full of memorabilia, including college pennants. You can find Tulane and LSU there, as a matter of fact. It's an old bar. It's got a wooden, it claims that it has the insides of what had been a bar in New York that was dismantled and brought to Paris. And it claims to be steeped in history. And there are some historical aspects to it. But they also have a casual attitude toward history. And I'll give you two examples. The first is that they claim that the first owner of the bar was Todd Sloan. And Sloan was a celebrated jockey. He invented the so-called monkey crouch position in racing. He married movie stars. He drank a lot. In fact, he died of cirrhosis of the liver. And so they make the point that it was Todd Sloan who started the bar. This is untrue. He didn't at all. The bar was started in 1911 by a different jockey, as a matter of fact. Todd Sloan came to manage the bar for a while and then eventually bought it, and that was in 1915. And the reason we know this is because there's an article in the New York Times, believe it or not, saying that Todd Sloan had just bought the bar. This is also quite interesting because why would you be writing a story about a bar in the New York Times? But Harry's was such a hangout for newspaper people that a story about Harry's or a change of ownership at Harry's was considered international news, which is saying quite a lot. The second thing about the bar that they say about themselves and tout and say repeatedly, they've even written a book about themselves in which they say this, is that Harry McElhone wrote his book, The ABC of Mixing Cocktails, in 1919. And there's no evidence for this either. The first copy anybody can find is a 1922 version, 1921 version, which for which there's a copy in the British Library. Nobody anywhere has shown me that they can have a 1919 version. Also, I have to say I like Harry's bar, and I particularly like Laurent Giraud, who is the maitre de bar, and who is very good at mixing drinks. He can mix the best French 75 you can imagine. The way he makes it is an offshoot of the version I just mentioned. It's champagne, gin, sugar, lemon juice, and absinthe. Doesn't have the Calvados. And he does a spectacular job, and he's very precise, which is what good bartenders do. But if you come in on a hectic night with the other bartenders, you won't get a drink made. You can't be assured you'll get a drink made the way Laurent would make it. In fact, I came in on a 4th of July, and the guy sitting next to me, who was a fireman from Pennsylvania, asked for a French 75. They threw in a bunch of absinthe in like a bucket practically worth, which is absolutely not the way to make it. And then they served it to him, not in a coupe, which is the way it's supposed to be served, but they served it to him in a brandy snifter. So contrary to Harry McElhone's very high standards, they've been let down, and a lot of people just come because they want the tourist experience. If you go, make sure you watch how they make the drink. The next place to go look for the French 75 is the Savoy Bar in the Savoy Hotel. It's very swanky. It is everything that Harry's is not. Harry's, for redecoration at Harry's, is just another layer of dust. And for the Savoy, it's a place that's always bright and shiny and constantly renovated. It's a place where they don't want to serve you anything or anything to happen that will make you unhappy. The whole idea when you're there is to be in heaven. And for that reason, they also make a French 75 that could have no one really be against it. And it's the version that has become probably the most popular and standard drink of all. And that's gin, champagne, lemon juice, sugar, no absinthe. Harry Craddock is given credit for this drink. Actually, there are several other people around the same time who invented the drink, although, well, one other person, I should say, who was in, his name was Judge. He went under the name Judge, and he was in New York, but the problem is New York had prohibition, and so he couldn't quite get the same level of credit. But Harry Craddock made it famous. and it's a good drink. So that's an important stepping stone. The Savoy is an important stone on the way to getting the full history. After the Savoy, we should probably take a little bit of a stop and think about what happens 15, 20 years after the war. And of course, at that point, the drink, the gun, the artillery gun, is not in everybody's mind. You don't go to a bar to order a drink to help you sound patriotic about World War I. The way I like to think about it is this was a drink that you didn't remember why it was called the French 75, but you were so intrigued by the name that it was, in a sense, propagandistic because it was so attractive. It was sexy. And if you think about it, if somebody walks into a bar and they say, I think I want to buy a phlegm cutter, which is a drink that H.L. Mencken, the famous Baltimore journalist, used to write about, nobody would think too highly of you. But if you come in and say you want to order a French 75, people, of course, might look at you and think, what's a French 75? And so that name helped carry it forward. It began to appear on posters and in movies, and two notably, Riptide, a movie where there's a very swanky hotel and people are having drinks and they're all dressed up, and somebody orders a forlorn woman who's just lost her boyfriend, orders a French 75 to drown her sorrows, and her new boyfriend or would-be boyfriend says boom, and she says boom to you. And it also appears in Casablanca, in a very moving scene in Casablanca, where it's treated in a patriotic way in Rick's Bar, which many of you probably know about since you've seen Casablanca as many times as I have, which is several thousand, where anyway, a woman who has been jilted by Rick comes to the bar, and she's not with a German soldier. Of course, the German soldiers were there in Casablanca, and she decides to order a French 75, which was her way of saying, I'm with a German soldier, but I'm still patriotic. And she says, line them up. I want a whole line of them. And the German soldier says, we'll just have one at a time, as in we'll take one country at a time. It's a very good scene. And shortly after that, they sing La Marseillaise in this very stirring scene. So the drink appears in all these settings. But then, of course, Prohibition comes and cocktail culture hangs on, certainly drinking hangs on. But after Prohibition, cocktail culture doesn't really revive. There are places like the Stork Club, which actually, in its famous cocktail book in 1946, talks about the French 75 and says it's enshrined in the pharmacopoeia of alcoholic artistry. But the Stork Club was not like the average place in the United States. It certainly wasn't your average bar. Remember, it's a place where one time Ernest Hemingway came in with a royalty check worth $100,000 and got it cashed there, and then he paid for everybody's drinks. But there is a turning point that comes when cocktails become have a resurgence, and the name becomes very attractive. And before I get to the New Orleanian part of this and the French 75 bar at Arno's, which is important in the story, I should point out a little personal story here about another bar in my hometown of Aurora, Illinois, which is down the street from where my father had a laundromat. Aurora's on the last stop of the commuter line going to Chicago. And one day, as I was hunting around the internet, lo and behold, I find out there's a French 75 lounge and art gallery across the Fox River in a kind of dumpy little place that I used to remember as a child. It's not dumpy anymore because I went back to check it out. And they have a thriving business. And why did they pick the French 75? Not because they liked the drink particularly. They picked it because they thought it sounded great. And then because they had now a name of French 75, they had to invent their own, which they did. And then they put two more on the menu, so they have three. And they're doing their part to keep the French 75 alive in Aurora, Illinois. The place where this is even more dramatic and more important is in Arno's, which had what was called the Grill Bar for many years. The Casbarians, when they bought the restaurant, decided to change the Grill Bar and make it look a little bit more antique with a nice back bar. And any of you have been there know what a glorious place that is. And they wanted to make it a kind of cocktail refuge off of Bienville and Bourbon Street and so streets. And so they decided to give it a feel like Paris, they ought to give it a new name. And so they called it the French 75 Bar. In fact, it was Jane Casbarian, the wife of the owner, who came up with this idea. And so what did they do? They created their own French 75. And that French 75 is made with cognac, lemon juice, simple syrup, and champagne. And it's very close to the original. It's not the original. And it had another big kick. Not only did it get a kick from being in Arno's, but also because Chris Hanna, who was just starting out his bartending career there and has, of course, become a celebrity among bartenders, helped put it on the map. And out of that, from that moment, the French 75, which had been sort of a second or third tier drink in New Orleans, if you go back and look at cocktail memorabilia, you find out, which is in one of our local museums in New Orleans, you see that it hardly ever was on the top of the list in cocktails, and sometimes not at all in our restaurants. And now it is almost everywhere. And so all of a sudden, thanks to French 75 Bar at Arno's and Chris Hanna and the revival of the cocktail culture, we have all kinds of French 75s everywhere, including the famous ones at Savoy, the ones made famous by Arno's, and then all kinds of other ones which get to the point of being crazy, including non-alcoholic French 75s, French 75 Jello shots, and a French 75 that exists in the Atlas Bar in Singapore, which consists of creme fraiche, salt, lemon, sugar, and a gin that is made out, it comes from Sri Lanka, that has curry leaves in it. So that's about as far as you can get from the 1915 version. I'm going to end here, but I'm going to make one little comment at the end. When I started on this book, I was an ingenue in cocktail culture, and I had a lot to learn. And that's made it fun for me, because in a way, this book is not just about a cocktail. It tries to tell the story about how cocktails adapt, how they're named, and the fact that, of course, there's a lot of showmanship behind them. So here's a little piece I read. I'm going to summarize it for you last year. And it was about an Italian-American archaeological team, which announced the discovery of a 5,000-year-old tavern in Lagash, which is a city in southern Iraq. A cuneiform tablet found among the ruins carried a recipe for beer, which the team believed to be the bar's most popular beverage, even exceeding water. Photos of the site showed piles of broken pottery, I call them mugs, strewn about, which I've laughingly said meant the last night they were in business, they must have had a hell of a good time. But I have to tell you the other thing that occurred to me as soon as I read that little story, that I bet you the owner of the Lagash Lounge had said that he was the starter of the first cocktail book, because bars like to say they're the first at everything. And I'm sure Lagash made a claim to that those 5,000 years ago. Cocktail history can be murky. People sitting around bars, don't take good notes. But cocktails are about storytelling, usually when you're sitting at the bar, and they're about theater. And the best cocktails are made precisely and served in front of you as a performance. And I hope this little history gives you a little bit of a kick when you have your own French 75, because now you know the background. Thanks. I'll be glad to take questions if anybody has them.
Thank you, John. Absolutely. If you have questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself, or if you want to put them in the chat, I'm happy to ask. I did want to ask to kick off the questions. Let me get this out of the way. When you mentioned that they got rid of the absinthe, was that in Chicago?
No, well, no, the absinthe only existed in France for a brief time. Yeah, well, it still exists as Harry's, yes.
Yeah, but one of the cocktails in maybe it was New York or Chicago, it did have originally, but then they got rid of the absinthe. Was it the reason that was absinthe also banned in the U.S. at the time? Was that the reason why they would have
Well,
not
absinthe was
tried to
banned in
add that in there?
absinthe was banned in Paris, even when it was being served,
Okay.
and it was banned in Great Britain, and it was I actually I don't know if it's banned in the United States. It may have been, well, but there's prohibition, so that's an irrelevant point, right?
Mhm.
But that didn't stop people from using absinthe. And what was really banned was the making of absinthe, not serving it actually. So as long as you had supplies, you could serve it. And if you didn't want to serve absinthe, you could serve things like what was that called? Oso de anise from Spain, same thing, or Pernod. They're all pretty much the same. I mean, they're not pretty
Yeah.
much the same as your aficionado, but they're
Talking about
similar.
Chris Hanna. When Chris Hanna was at the French 75 bar, did he just make one French 75, or would he make different kinds of French 75 so that people could try different things? Because it sounds like Chris Hanna is vital to this story, especially New Orleans wise. Sorry about the dog.
Yes, well, he is. I don't know if they made other. There are all kinds of variations of French 75s. You know, French 75s made with vodka, for example, and that's one of the charming aspects, I guess, of French 75s. Although I don't care about the vodka one much, but I don't know if he was making other ones. But the one he made famous was the one that is the standard French 75 at Arnaud's. And I feel pretty sure that if they made a French 75 at Arnaud's that was different from their normal one, they wouldn't have called it a French 75. They would have given it a different name.
Gotcha. He is a traditionalist. Um, the last one was obviously the book talks about other cocktails, specifically New Orleans cocktails. I hate to put you on the spot, but after the French 75, what is your next favorite drink? You don't have the
Well,
items. You don't have the
yeah.
items to make the French 75. What are you making out of your book?
Well, say that again.
I said you don't have the items to make a French 75, so you have to make something else in
Oh,
your
I
book.
see. Well,
Yeah.
uh, uh, I really like Manhattans, and there's a version of that of Manhattans that
Resource.
the woman in my life and I have found in the inn at Little Washington in Virginia, which is an excellent drink and has two different kinds of vermouth and chocolate bitters and Peychaud bitters and a little bit of cherry herring, and it's an outstanding drink. But even a standard Manhattan's very good. And I like Negronis, and I'm a pretty ecumenical drinker.
BB Miller says he loves a Negroni, so you obviously it's well known. Well, John, I want to thank you so much for talking to us tonight. You really painted a great picture of of the story and how encompassing it is, and really some really neat stories to it. We will be emailing everybody tomorrow the link to the recording who's not here, and then you can also a link to purchase the book. So, John, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I want to thank everybody for being here as well. And we'll see you guys back in April.
Thank you.
Thank you.